Okay, so can you please confirm to me that you can see my shared screen? Yes, okay, thank you very much. So let us now move on a bit further into A-frame. And today we are going to see things that can make our environments a bit more interesting, I think. So I'll try to cover chapter 13 and 14. So let's start by this one. And again, just to repeat, um, if you have any difficulties, if there's anything that you haven't understood in relation to any thing we have seen so far, please let me know, and I can try to repeat or to show um, uh, different examples to try to make things a bit more clear. Uh, so, but for this chapter 13, see, this is about textures and textures. Uh, this is actually a word, so a concept that is often used in 3D modeling. And so it basically means that you kind of uh, apply um, an image to a 3D object, to kind of a geometry. You kind of dress the geometry with a picture, with an image. And this is called a texture. And so basically it allows us to do this that you can see in this first example. So here we see a box, a sphere, and a cylinder, um, much like um, the objects we have seen yesterday, but these are textured. So we have applied images to them. And let me just show this in a bigger window. So in this example, again, my examples are usually very simple, very simplistic, actually. And so this is kind of meaningless in terms of the environment it is creating. But it already, I think it already shows that you can use textures to achieve a kind of a particular effect and to change how a given 3D object um, is interpreted by the user. So, for example, this cylinder, by applying a texture of the bark of a tree, you can make it look like a tree. You can make it look like the trunk of a tree. So textures are usually used with this effect to try to change how things look to users so that it's easier to kind of interpret objects in a given way. Um, so how do we do this? Uh, Actually, you already kind of already saw how to do this, or at least you changed an example where this was being used. Um, so, but in that at that time, I didn't draw attention to how it was structured. So let us see how what we need to do in our code to have textures applied to objects. And the first thing to understand is that these images that they may be they sometimes are large files, so they are stored in files, and this can be rather large. So we need to first try to make sure that um, the pictures are as small as possible. So if we can use a texture uh, in a file or an image that is smaller, then we should try to do that. But sometimes we still end up with a rather large file. So it's important to understand that this image that they will have to be downloaded, and so it will make our environment take a bit more time to load. So it's important to be aware of that. Um, And because of mainly because of this, because these textures, they and other files that we will want to use, they take some time to load. A-frame uses it separates the usage of textures into parts. So one part is for us to say to A-frame that we need to download that particular image file. So that A-frame, the instant that we load our environment in our browser, it starts downloading all the files that will be necessary. And then in the second part, we tell A-frame to which object, to which 3D object or primitive we want to apply that texture to. So we kind of have two steps to go through. So the first one, for the first step, we need to add this special A-frame element, which is called assets. So A-assets. And inside the assets, we uh, insert an IMG element. Notice that this element is actually the same HTML element that we also use in regular web pages, but here it kind of has a slightly different meaning. So here we are just saying to A-frame that we need to download this file, this image file, and we do that by using this src attribute with a value that corresponds to the URL of the image. And these URLs are often um, taken from Glitch itself. So we go to that assets folder and we copy the URL just like you did in one of the first sessions. With this IMG element, we also do another thing, which is to give a proper name to this texture. And this is where we use the IDs. So remember that in one of the last sessions, I talked a bit about, in not very much detail, but I mentioned that there was an attribute that we could use in any element. And this is one example where we will take, uh, we will make use of that attribute. So we give an ID to this particular image, and in this case, I'm just calling it box texture because I knew that this was the image that I wanted to apply to the box uh, that exists in my scene. So I just call it box texture. But you of course can use whatever name you want. Just make sure that it's a meaningful name for you, so that you don't make um, many mistakes when you try to use that image file. So in this first step, we do kind of these two things. We tell A-frame where the image is, and we give it a name. And then in the second step, so we apply the texture, the image, to any object that we like. In these snippets here, uh, we are applying to the box, and applying a texture to the box is simply adding an additional attribute. In this case, it's called src. So notice that the attribute has the same name that we used in the IMG, but here it is saying to the box, it is saying for it to go to this image file and just apply the image on all faces of the box. An important thing to notice, and I kind of highlighted it here in the chapter, so if you go through this chapter again later on, that you pay attention to this, because this is an often made mistake. That's why I'm drawing attention to it. When we assign a proper name, so when we give an ID to the texture here in the assets element, notice that the ID is simply a word or a set of words that we choose wherever we want. But when we are applying the texture to the primitive, we have to prefix the name that we used before with that hash symbol. Okay, so this is what the hash symbol is actually what tells A-Frame that the word that we are using is the ID of an already defined texture. Okay, and so this allows it A-Frame to make the connection between what it sees here in this source attribute. So this SRC is actually short for source. It allows it to make the connection with an ID that it can find in another place in our HTML. So this is very important to keep in mind because we often, and even I still do this mistake. So it's very easy to make this mistake. And we just write in the source box texture without the hash symbol. This won't work. So we need to kind of try to pay attention to that. And so if we do that and notice that, so here in this snippet of code, I have been using just one, but you can add several image files to the assets, give them different names, and then apply different textures to different objects, just like in this example. I'm going to show you the source code of this first example so that you see what's been done here. So notice the assets. Usually, this is not mandatory, but usually we write these assets elements right in the beginning of the scene, because this kind of represents um, uh, necessary files for the whole scene that comes later, and so it kind of makes sense to write this at the beginning. Although for A-Frame it's the same. If you write this at the end, it will still download all the files in the beginning. So here we have several assets. We are using the IMG element for all of them, and then for the various primitives that we are using, we just refer to um, the proper image file that we want to use as texture. For example, here in the box, we are using box texture hash box texture, which is this first file. For the sphere, we are using hash moon, which is this file here. And for the cylinder, we are using hash trivarch, which is this one here. There's actually one asset that is not being used in this example, and this is kind of also natural to occur because we make several experiments to try different textures to see if they visually work or not. And so sometimes we leave assets that are not actually used afterwards. What you should try to do when you kind of create the final file, the final experience, is to clean up the unused files so that they don't take additional time to load the scene. One other small aspect here about the assets, which may be kind of important to clarify, is that this IMG element is actually an exception to most HTML elements, because this element does not have a closing tag. So if you notice, we use the starting tag for the IMG, but there's no closing tag. Okay, and this is actually how it works. So the IMG element does not need and should not have a closing tag. Okay, so it's just an opening tag, because this is a special element for HTML without content, because the content is actually going to be loaded by the browser, which is the image, and it's going to replace um, the, 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 the tag, the img tag, so it cannot have any other content, and so it doesn't need and cannot have a closing, an ending tag. But so this is kind of a small thing, that just to make sure that you try to have HTML that is properly written. Although in most situations, browsers will kind of step over these small mistakes and they will show things correctly. But still, if we have many of these small mistakes, they sometimes show up, and we need to afterwards to figure out what is happening and correct. So if you try to write things correctly at the beginning, it's better. So what else can we do with textures? One thing that is often useful is to kind of repeat the same image over and over again on the same face, on one face of the object. So what does this mean? It means that you can create a small file with a texture, and then kind of apply it like a mosaic, and just have a repeating pattern. And if you create your textures this way, then you have smaller files, smaller image files, and that is good. And then you just repeat the same pattern. Uh, but if the repeating pattern is well crafted, then it doesn't show that much. It's not easy to for the user to understand that there is something that is actually just repeating itself. Uh, and so how do we repeat a texture? Well, it's actually very simple. We just need to add the repeat attribute. And this another aspect to keep in mind is that when we apply a texture to any 3D primitive, like this box, for example, the textures, the image files are actually applied on each face independently. So it's not like we are wrapping the 3D object with a single file. It's more like we are like pasting the same file, the same image on each side of the object. And so the repeat attribute, what it says is it has two values, and it just means how many times we want to repeat the image on the X axis and on the Y axis. And here, of course, this has to be interpreted in a 2D reference frame. So we just need to look to imagine that this is the face of my box, and so it's 2D, and so it has an x-axis, horizontal, and a vertical axis, and the repeat just says how many times I want to repeat the same image horizontally and vertically. I'll show you a few examples here, or at least one example here, which is this one. I'll open first in a new tab, and here it's exactly the same image that is being applied as a texture. We are only changing that repeat attribute. And so here in the middle one, the middle box, it has the default. So we are applying the texture, the image file, exactly one time horizontally and one time vertically. On the left, we say that we want to apply just half the image. We can also do that. It's perhaps not as common, but we can do that. So instead of using the whole image to cover this face, we are just using half. So it's like if you look at this one, so if you imagine just this small square, you take this small square from the picture and then you enlarge it to cover the whole face. So this is what's happening here in the left box. And on the right box, we are repeating twice. Um, so it's instead of applying the image to the whole face, we are applying the image one time here on this square and then just repeating again and applying another image here on this and the same vertically. So in this case, we apply the same image to one face. We apply the same image 4 times. So we repeat twice on the horizontal and twice on the vertical. And so I'll show you the source code here. So just to confirm. So on the left box, we have a repeat of 0.5, 0.5. Again, this is the order is always horizontal and then vertical. On the middle one, just repeat 1, 1, and this is the default. So we actually did not need to write this. And on the right, we are repeating twice horizontally and twice vertical. If you wanted, you could repeat twice horizontally or 3 times and just once vertically. Although if you do that, you'll probably distort the texture and it might not look very good, but it depends on the picture itself, on the image that you use. So it's something that you can do also. And now just to give an idea of what kind of textures, what kind of images we can actually use as textures. I'm just going to show you a few different examples. So technically, it doesn't change much from what we have already seen. So using textures is kind of an easy thing to do. I'll just show you a few different examples. So the first one is that we can use video as a texture also. And this is a nice thing that you can try to do to kind of enrich your environments. So in some situations, it might be useful to have kind of a dynamic object uh, whose faces keep changing with the video. And the way to do that is actually very simple. So what we have to do is first we need to add in the assets, instead of using an IMG element, we use a video element. And again, we assign an ID so that we can then refer to that video. We tell it where the video is. So we say what is the source of the video, the URL. And for videos, this might be important also to add, to tell A-Frame to start the video automatically, because otherwise we would need some kind of a button to for the user to start playing the video. And also, usually, but this depends, usually we want the video to play over and over again. So we may want to tell it that we want to loop the video. Notice that the video element here, it's a bit different from the IMG because the video element should be closed, so it should have a closing tag. Also notice, so these are small things that start to make our scenes, the source code in our scenes a bit more complicated. So these are small aspects that I'll just draw your attention to them to try to make it easier for you than to try not to make these mistakes. Notice that in the assets, so this is the code for inside the assets at the top of the scene. So in there, we use the video element. And afterwards, we may want to display the video kind of on a floating panel, like in this example here. And in this case, let me just lower my audio because I'm not streaming the audio to you, but this video has audio. When we want to apply the video, in this case, like in this floating panel, there's a primitive, an A-frame primitive, which is called A-video. So it's important not to mistake the two because they have different meanings. So video here is to load in the assets. A video is a 3D object to display the video to the user. And then to texture, we do the same thing. So you just need to apply the source attribute and use the hash symbol to refer to that texture. But notice in this example, I'm going to show the source code here. So in this example, so that we see the whole source code. So we have the assets. In this case, the assets only has one element, one asset actually, which is the video. So we give the ID, autoplay, the loop. This is actually not needed, so you can just ignore this attribute. We tell it where the source is, and in this case, this is actually from the assets folder in our glitch project. And then notice that we are applying the same texture, which is a video, to two different objects, 3D objects. So the first is a video panel that floats above the user. So here we have the source hash video, and we also apply it to the box with the same way. So source hash video, and of course for the box, I'm just going to show a move around. Notice how the video, again, this is a regular texture, so the video is applied equally to all faces of, to all the 6 faces of the box, okay? Okay, so I'm going to close this, and actually I'm going to reload this web page here so that the video stops because it is streaming. It has audio, and it's kind of annoying to me to keep hearing the audio. So video as a texture, I think important thing, useful thing to know about. Then there's another kind of texture that you are actually going to apply in your own project, which is which are called technically, these are called equirectangular images, and they basically correspond to the planisphere. So you know, when you look at the map of the Earth, so it's a flattened version of the Earth, and it's the same thing. So it's a planisphere, and so these pictures, they correspond basically to the 360 photos that we see often. And so we can actually, in A-frame, we can use this kind of textures, and when we apply this to a sphere, and if we are inside that sphere, it will look like we are inside that photographic scene. And so A-frame automatically understands this kind of textures and maps the image correctly to the sphere. And so in this case, this is actually a photo from one of your classrooms. So I took this the last time I was there, actually with one of those cameras, 360 cameras that you have there. And when we apply, I'm going to first show you the source code. No, actually, I'm going to first show you the environment. So this is how it looks when we apply that 360 photo as a texture to a large sphere around us. So in this scene, the user is inside the sphere, and so it really looks like you can see the actual room all around you. So it's a very cool effect. And the source code, and in this case, actually, to do this kind of 360 photos, there are a number of alternatives in A-frame. So for now, I'm just going to show you one. So again, in the assets, we load all the images that we are going to need. So in this case, we needed um, two images, two textures, one for the brick. There's a box that sits here on top of a table, and this is actually a 3D object. So this was not part of the photo, and this object is textured, and so we need that file, which is the bricks image, and we need also that 360 photo, so the equi-rectangular photo that we took with a 360 camera. And we give, in this case, we give the ID classroom. And then we have a box with that texture, so this is not very important. Right now, we already saw this. But then we have a sky, and this is an element that I think I mentioned before, but I don't think we have applied this yet. So this A-sky, kind of like the name implies, this is here like to work as a sky, as a very far away sphere. So it's actually a sphere that is very far away from the user. I think it's about, by default, I think it has a radius of, I think 500 or 5,000. I think it's 500 meters. So it's a sphere with a kilometer of diameter, and we are inside that sphere. And so we can apply a texture to that sphere. In this case, the texture is the 360 photo. And that is why this looks like this. So you can look anywhere, but because you are inside that sky, that sphere, you always have the texture to look at. In this example, this example also serves to talk already about another aspect that is very specific to the use of 360 photos, because a 360 photo is taken from a single perspective. So you either use a 360 camera, for example, that takes the photo in one shot, or you use your smartphone and you need to try to keep in the same place while you rotate your phone around you, because it's important to take the photo from a single point in space. And so the user, when he's looking, right now we are looking this screen at the 360 photo, we cannot change our perspective or our position. We should not be able to change our position in space. Otherwise, the perspective will not be the same perspective as when the picture was taken. And so in this environment, we should try to prevent users from moving around. So if you load this example in your computer and you try to use the arrow keys, they don't work. I have disabled them. And so this example also shows how to do that. And this is basically done with this. Actually, I'm going back to the chapter, and because it's also here described. So the way to disable movement of the user for these 360 scenes is to add the A-camera primitive. This is an element that we often don't need to add because A-frame adds a camera by default. So the camera actually represents the user's eyes, and by default A-frame adds this to the scene. But when we want to prevent the user from walking around, we need to add the camera ourselves. And so we add the camera, and we also add an attribute to that camera, which is this strangely named attribute, which is actually 3 words. So WASD dash controls dash enabled equal false. So this basically means disable the WASD controls. And the WASD controls, this is kind of the gaming term for moving around. It's the so the alternative set of keys that you can press to move around. Instead of pressing the arrow keys, you can press the W, A, or S, or D. So this disables moving around in the 3D environment. And to finish, just to also let you know that we can also have a 360 scene based on a video. And you can actually do that with the 360 camera, the cameras that you have there at USJ. Uh, they can record videos. Uh, this is perhaps not as often done as with static images, but you can have um, a 360 video and just load the video like we did before here in the assets, and then just apply it to the sky if you would like, as we did. Or for specifically for videos, we also have a video sphere primitive that we can use. That basically shows, I'm going to show this. So a video sphere in this case is like an alternative to the sky. So don't worry too much, just use one or the other. Actually, in this example, I even left the sky element here. I just commented it out so that you can then try activating one or the other. And so the effect is this. I'm going to open this in a new tab. And this is a kind of strange video that I found on the internet. Just kind of an abstract city and the user moving around. And at the end, so the video does not loop, so it just pauses. And so video spheres or 360 videos can also be used. You just need to be a bit careful because videos, this kind of videos in VR, they might um, be kind of hard to understand for the user, and they might cause some kind of VR sickness depending on the type of video. So should be a bit careful about this. Um, just one last thing. This is not about a frame. It's actually about HTML, but also important to know, or at least mildly important to know, which is that we can disable elements in our HTML by commenting them. So this is um, usually when we talk about programming languages, we talk about commenting the code, which means disabling the code. And in HTML, the way to disable a line of code is by using this set of strange characters together. So we start the line with a less than, exclamation mark, and then two dashes. And this is written without any space in between. And then we end the line with two dashes and a greater than symbol. And this disables everything that is between these two symbols, this start comment and this end comment. And so this is a nice way to kind of try out different things in our HTML without deleting them, because sometimes we don't know what is going to work. And so we just comment out something, try another, and if it doesn't work, we go back to our previous versions. So just to let you know, for example, in this, I'm actually going to do this to make it more clear. So I'm going to copy the source code for this last example that I showed. And I'm going actually to close all these tabs that I have opened, and I'm going to my projects, and I'm going to add a new file just to test. So I'm going to kind of simulate what you are probably going to do later on. So I'm adding a new file, I'm just going to call it video.html, and I'm going to paste the source code that I had copied, and I'm going to preview, and this should of course show me this exactly the same thing as we saw before. So the video, and now I'm just going to change. So instead of using the video sphere element, I'm going to use the sky element. So I'm going to remove the comments from this line, and I'm going to add, because we should not have both, because otherwise they will be one on top of the other. So I'm going to comment out the video sphere now. Okay, so I disabled the video sphere and I have enabled the sky. And now I'm going to reload and see what changes. Okay, as you can see, nothing changes, and this is expected. So video sphere in this situation is kind of an alternative to the sky. Okay, so but you can do this when you see something like this commented out. So it's in glitch, it shows these lines grayed out. So you can just remove these initial characters and these last characters to uh, re-enable that line of code. And so this actually ends this chapter about textures.